Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for Sage Method Space, and I'm here today with the co-authors of this very interesting new book, Making Sense of Social Research Methodology. But before we begin our conversation, if you're new to Method Space, this is a blog community hosted by Sage Publications, and we're interested in all kinds of things to do with planning, designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results in all kinds of different ways. And you can see at the heart of this Venn diagram, teaching and learning, because we feel like, we've all got something to learn, whether you're a student or an experienced researcher trying out a new approach. So all of that in the context of hopefully making some impact and creating real change in the world with the research that we do. So why don't we get started by introducing yourselves.
Maybe I can go first.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Pengfei Zhao, and I'm an assistant professor of qualitative methodology in the College of Education at University of Florida. So I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much for our guru, Janet, for inviting us to do this video interview, and also for inviting us to do the mentor in residence to contribute to the method space. And we are super excited to engage in the conversation with the community here. Yeah.
Thank you. Pei Wei?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Pei Wei Li, and I teach at Lesley University in the Counseling and Psychology Division, and I also teach in the Counseling Psychology PhD program at Lesley, and similar to Pengfei, just so glad to be here.
And Karen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Ross. I am a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts in Boston in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. I teach both master's students in conflict resolution and PhD students in our Global Governance and Human Security PhD program. And I'm also very excited to be here today and have a chance to share our text with you and just dialogue with my co-authors.
And Barb?
Hi, I'm Barbara Dennis. I'm a faculty member at Indiana University, and I teach in the Inquiry Methodology PhD program primarily. We also have a master's degree program. I teach qualitative research courses with a critical feminist orientation, and also courses that this particular textbook would be relevant for. And I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited about the book, and I love every opportunity I get to spend time with these three wonderful women.
Well, it's a good sign that after the rigors of writing a book together, you still want to talk to each other. So that's a good start. I had a chance to read your book, and there were a few things that kind of jumped out at me as being, particularly interesting that, I'd like to discuss today. So to start with, I think, it's having worked a lot with doctoral students and people designing research that, often they think about research as being in kind of discrete stages. And that can lead to some problems, not only with the incoherent design, but not really being able to kind of maximize what they get from each stage because they don't see how they're connected. But in your book, you start out at the very beginning talking about the idea of research as kind of a tree with roots and branches. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that way of thinking.
So well, maybe we should start question to Pei Wei because she came up originally with this wonderful metaphor.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I can get started. I'm pretty sure my my friends here will have more to say about that. Yeah, I think, Jenny, so glad you're asking that question, because for us, the reason we want to write this book is felt like in our own teaching, as Barbara said earlier, we actually all have taught or have been teaching that introductory course on the for master students, and what we found is research is often the common perception they bring to class is that it's instrumental, like research is just procedure, and them themselves are seem like harder for them to see they're part of that research process, and research almost feel like it's the experts they do and exist in vacuum, and and this notion of objectively observe and measure, that's the image the student bring to class. And I feel like for us, we want them to see the tree, I mean, roots and branches, it's alive. It's not just assembly line step by step. It's we're part of that. Researchers are always part of that, and where we're coming from, our assumptions, our life experiences, and our professional other parts of our life is also part of that inquiry process as well. So I think tree to us, it seemed like this holistic, organic view to counter that sterile, stepwise kind of image.
Right.
If I can just,
Sure.
oh, sorry, can I just,
Yeah.
I just wanted to say also, I mean, I think one of the things that really resonated for me when we first started talking about this metaphor is that, you know, our textbook also takes a quite different approach to presenting the process as a whole, in terms of it not being like a linear set of procedures, as you said, Janet, but really founded on, you know, we've got this, it's divided into 3 clusters, and the whole first cluster is these what we are thinking of as the roots of the inquiry process. These concepts that are integral, like really throughout, issues around power, around ontology and epistemology, knowledge, identity, ethics, and so forth, that are often presented in very discrete ways, or you know, and not presented in a way that's integral. And you know, I think for me, what really resonates with thinking about the tree metaphor is that the roots kind of help bring, they connect to the rest of the tree in a really foundational way, right? They're setting the foundation for everything else. And you know, I think about I was just actually talking to a student about this today, who was asking me about, was reading a chapter about language use in qualitative and quantitative research, and how when you write quantitative studies, it's often written from the third person perspective, and if you read a qualitative study, then it's often much more kind of the researcher, much more first person language, and the researchers incorporated. And you know, she says, question, well, what about mixed method studies? What should I do there? And I was thinking to myself, well, you know, if you think about what are the assumptions that are behind the use of these different linguistic forms, right? Then think about what are the assumptions that you're drawing from, right? Rather than thinking about it as a discrete part, that language is a discrete part of the write-up, and, you know, but rather than it being a discrete part of the write-up, that it's really linked back to these fundamental assumptions that are also helping shape your design choices and your data collection procedures and so forth. So, you know, the tree metaphor, I think, really helps elucidate that in a very visual way for me.
Well, it's a great lead into the second question that I had, and I was going to just read a short quote from the introduction. It means that we turn the table around, shifting away from presenting research from a third person perspective and challenging the idea of quote unquote pure research that only experts do. It means instead that we build the very conception of research as deeply rooted in personal, relational, and sociocultural contexts from the bottom up, not seeing those contexts as peripheral dimensions that can be added onto what would typically be considered the fundamentals of research. So, you know, talk about why this will be important. And given that, you know, the title of your book, you talk about, you know, for students or practitioners. So how does this kind of way of thinking, you know, help new researchers, whether they are students or experienced researchers who are ready to try something new, or people who are maybe not in a formal academic role, but are conducting, other kinds of research or even evaluation. Who would like to start? How about you, Barb, since you didn't speak on the last one?
I noticed that Pong Fei unmuted herself, so why don't I let Pong Fei speak and then I'll chime in.
Well, okay. I think I would very much want to highlight this idea of, when we talk about, say, practitioners' role in conducting research, there seems to be a specific research design of a specific research type that is designated for practitioners. Sometimes we call it action research.
Right.
And I think this is the very place that we want to problematize in terms of thinking, think how we conceptualize research, and in terms of talking about some of the major characteristics of our own approach to research methodology. Again, I can't agree more with Karen's idea, what Karen just said about, some of the discrete ways of conceptualizing research often leads us to, if you do action research, there is, XYZ procedures and stages or concepts you need to consider. But what we really would like to show in this book is to think about some of the more foundational or fundamental connections between, say, our everyday life and our research practice, our ways of being, like the way how we be a person and become a researcher or become a professional in our life, and the deep connection between the ways of being, the ways of becoming, and the way how we do research. So in that sense, I mean, I think there are many manifestations of this in the book. We want to really connect the everyday life on the one hand and the research practice on the other hand. So for example, when we consider ethics, or when we consider the implications of research, the impact of research. So instead of action research, what we would like to unpack and elaborate on in this book is, action as research, research as action. Barbara, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll jump in because one of the things I was thinking was about we've paid some attention to the notion of identity in this textbook. And I think if you can read lots and lots of methodology textbooks and never see a discussion of identity. And you might see something like in qualitative articles, you might see some things about researcher positionality, which could be a manifestation of identity. But our idea here is that who you are is not disconnected from research. And that's relevant as a student, as a practitioner. You bring things to the research process. And there's two aspects of this, which I think get really misunderstood in more traditional ways of thinking about research. One of those is that bringing yourself to the research process always constitutes a bias.
Right.
And we really want to put forward the ways in which bringing oneself to the research, which in fact you can't help but do, has a plus side, has positives. What does it mean? What experiences do you have in your everyday life that help make you stronger at doing this particular research study? And that's really important. We don't want to equate the idea of identity with bias. The other thing that it deconstructs in a really important way is this notion that we really advocate for a social justice orientation and for diversity. And if you don't acknowledge identity, you have absolutely no ground for being inclusive, for admitting that that diversity brings strength to the project and to the orientation. And so we don't see student perspectives or practitioner perspectives as being limited. We see them as being beneficial and fruitful and having something to bring to the table that this idea of expertise knowledges really distances itself from. But I think that that's really positive. So we really take up this notion of identity, not just as a foundational roots concept, but how does that infuse and become parts of ways in which we're generating data, parts of ways in which we're taking seriously our responsibilities and accountabilities in writing and in analysis, and how does that play out for ethics? So I think that notion of, thinking about our being and who we are as already an essential part of any inquiry that we engage with, not as something external to it or not as something we have to try to divorce or separate from, is really fundamental. And I think it's a unique part of the book.
Right. Well, I think, you bring up very important points. We've actually highlighted in a couple of other series of posts about the role of the researcher and the importance of, thinking about, who you are as a researcher. And, I will link to some of those other articles for people who are watching this and are interested in that topic. And, from my point of view, just, today, how can we not acknowledge the need to think about inclusion, diversity, impact, again, not as, separate things out there, or that, well, I'll do my research, then I'll think about how it's going to create some impact, but that, that this is, part of your tree, part of the whole, growth of the study, from the design through conducting it, and, being self-aware, because we want to avoid undue researcher bias, but at the same time to see, and, that we really, need to consider our roles, and that our roles, going back to the earlier point, are not simply to be experts at kind of enacting some protocols, but, really coming to the questions with a mode of inquiry and openness. So, I think that it's really valuable to introduce those kinds of ideas to people who are, starting perhaps, with a book like this, to begin to understand what being a researcher really means. So, anybody else want to add anything to that question?
Can I just say one more thing? If we, by bringing in this idea of identity, it allows us to supplant the dangerous idea of neutrality in research with things that are more, amenable to really engaging in valid research, which are things like inclusiveness and openness, that are really hard to bring in as important modes of validation if you're tethering your sense of validity to something that might be neutral or not.
Right. And, I'm sure that we could all talk for quite a long time about just, the kind of fallacy of thinking that, anyone is really neutral, and, we don't care whether it's qualitative or quantitative. We've seen plenty of lying with numbers or shaping research, quantitative research, in such a way that, kind of, points it in a certain direction. So I think that the concepts we're talking about and the ideas about what it means for us as researchers applies, whatever kind of research you're doing. And perhaps even more important for quantitative or mixed methods researchers who whose texts have really, not taken a look at some of those factors. So I think that's a kind of a good lead into, another point that I liked in chapter 5 about ways of knowing. And, again, thinking about, for student researchers when they're, looking at epistemology and ontology and thinking like, in theory, I know my doctoral students were always like, oh, just tell me how to do this. It's not like, that kind of deep, the philosophical side, is sometimes more obtuse, for new researchers to understand and to understand how it plays into research. But I think you've explained that in a clear ways, but, perhaps, talk a little bit about that, the importance of embracing different ways of knowing and how that fits with the research process.
Sure, I can get started. Karen, would you want to say something? Okay.
Go ahead, Pei.
So I think what I'm going to say is connected to what has been said. It just may remind me this, why is a tree? It's in my mind, there's a lot of things popping up. I will start with that, what Barbara said about identity and positionality. And that way of knowing, I think I saw my students, and I hope them engage with first, and also the textbook, how we lay it out, is to start to critically reflect how they coming in with their way of knowing, what are some life experiences and various assumption that has been shaping them, how the perception of research, sometimes the stereotype about research, and sometimes this emotional reaction. A lot of students feel intimidated, feel alienated, feel like this is not what I do. I'm just a practitioner. So there's a lot of rifts of how they perceive research. So I think from that reflection, for them to see there is a multiple way how we enter knowledge production. So if we kind of step back from the term research to knowledge production and making knowledge claim, and it's easier to have a conversation for them to see how the relationship between knowledge and power, and what knowledge being perceived as legitimate, what not, what kind of historical context that may have shaped that, and whose voices and perspective are more centered and whose are excluded. So from that, I think kind of bring in more naturally to think about this notion of social justice and diverse perspectives, and in a kind of contextualized way. I think often I saw my students have those good kind of aha moment to see, I can inquiry process. I've been doing something in my daily life, in my professional life, is not that different. So the rift will become smaller if kind of really deconstruct that rift a little bit. And so that's I found important to for them to see, and connecting. For example, I teach counseling students. I often compare counseling processes and research processes, and how they understand people from different views, and have a different identities and positionalities. And so as when students can draw that connection between the formal research and their everyday experiences, I think they understand a lot more about epistemology, ontology. Those things are a mouthful terminology, but it's there already. Yeah.
Yeah, Pei Wei, you said quite a bit of what I was gonna say, but just to add on to it a little bit, I think it's really this notion to emphasize what Pei Wei was saying. We want to kind of emphasize this idea that we are all already coming to this with certain assumptions about the world and about what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes legitimate knowledge. And so part of what we see our role as in the textbook is to start a conversation with our students, or with the readers, right? Tacit conversation, to just critically ask some questions about what are those assumptions, where do they come from, right? Why is it that, you know, for the most part, for the last up until, you know, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, that you couldn't read an article that was written in the first person perspective, right?
Mhm.
What are our assumptions about how we should approach the knowledge and the inquiry, the research and the inquiry process, and, you know, our connection to it or lack of connection to it. So, you know, it's not so much about I think, you know, we talk about concepts like intelligent epistemology, as Pei said, it's a mouthful, right? But they're not actually new concepts for a lot of our students. It's a way of, it's new language for something that they are already engaging with in their everyday lives, in their professional lives. And so, you know, I think a key part of what we're trying to do is just kind of help guide some questioning, perhaps, of where the basis for the assumptions that they already have.
So would you describe that as also applying to, say, identifying your research problem, identifying your research questions? How do you know that this is a problem? You know, I just wrote a post a week or so ago that I'll also link to this with this interview, about kind of looking at problems from the inside or from the outside. You know, so do we know that something is a problem worthy of research, or that would be important to study, you know, because we've seen it or experienced it, or because, you know, there's a gap in the literature, you know, and we have a scholarly need, you know, what forms of knowing about a problem, you know, are, you know, valuable, you know, when we're trying to say, get a proposal approved.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually makes me think of a very specific example that we bring up in the textbook. I think it's in the chapter on identity, actually, and on action research and legitimate knowledge and maybe Barbara, you can say a little bit more about this specific example, but it has to do with a student in one of Barbara's classes who was interested in child rearing practices, and a conversation that Barbara had with another student who did not think that this was an appropriate or significant topic worthy of research. And so I think this question of, does the problem come from the inside or the outside, as you put it, Janet, or, you know, who decides what makes research significant, is itself, you know, a little bit a question of who has the power to decide. And so that's part of what we're trying to raise some critical reflection about.
Well, you know, like you say, I mean, it totally ties into identity in many ways, in terms of, well, who gets to be a researcher? You know, I mean, who gets to go into a graduate program or a doctoral program and conduct research? I mean, anyone can conduct independent research, and certainly, you know, we have a lot of methods-based readers who are interested in independent, you know, work as independent researchers, and you know, you may have seen my byline as a free-range scholar, so I'm you know, definitely in that camp. But you know, I think about, I mean, when I went back to school as a single mother with 3 kids, I mean, I was like a really you know, foreign, they did not know what to do with me. People like me did not go to graduate school. So then, you know, you say, well, what was the frame of reference, the ways of knowing of the people who, in that experience at Cornell University, where I was, you know, proud and you know, happy that I was able to, you know, to go to a place like that. But, you know, the fact that I was such an anomaly tells you that, you know, the people who are coming through before that, you know, are coming through with a very different frame of reference in terms of life experience. So if you know, those are the only kinds of people who get to be researchers, then, you know, how does that skew, you know, the kinds of problems that we study? And, you know, that's you know, that's a very, you know, it's a big topic and, you know, a whole nother, you know, area to study. But I think what, you know, coming back to your book, you know, one of the reasons that I think this will be a useful book for a lot of people is that, you know, you really, even though it you approach research from a um, I don't want to say basic perspective in a um, you know, pejorative way, but, you know, in an accessible way that, you know, someone who is new to research could understand, but also, you know, encompassing some of these things, which are really, you know, very, very large questions about, you know, I mean, the questions about power and all of that, you know, have to do even with who gets to come into the door to begin with.
I think one thing, the conversation about who gets to be a researcher and who has the very right way to talk about the research really reminds me of the conversation we had, since the start of this project. It's like how we can meet our students where they are. I mean, this sounds like a super simple question, and you also heard a lot of people talk about, in their teaching, they would like to meet their students where they are. But the more I think about this, like we think about this, the more the conversation really makes me realize that it's so much more complex than, the a few words we put together here. Um, for example, like the whole project about this book was actually originated from um, some conversations and some challenges we encountered as instructors, and also this research project we did together, just to really committed to understand how our students came to know, and what are some of the um, assumptions, beliefs, and existing experience that they brought into these research methodology courses, and what are their ways to come to understand, research. And what we found is really this profound learning and unlearning journey that they need to go through, they need to undertake in order to become a researcher. And we realized that there's such a profound scaffolding process. Now, when we talk about scaffolding, we tend to think about, there might be some concepts or vocabularies that our students may have already known, and we want to build their concepts or their knowledge as if we're building a house from there. But I think the whole project profoundly shifts my way of thinking about this. Is like how we can tap into their experience, their what we tend to call the know-how knowledge, as opposed to those of know what knowledge, the knowledge that
Right.
they can imagine as those pieces of bricks in their knowledge mentioned, but to think about their experience, to think about some of their strengths that they can draw from their everyday life. And so that part, how to scaffolding that, and how to lead them, or how to walk with them, so that they can find their own research questions, so that they can find that inner motivation for them to become a researcher, and a researcher that not defined by experts, but defined by their own dreams and their own commitments. Yeah.
Well, I have kind of one more big question from the chapter 9 that I think ties in with some of the things we've already discussed. And in this chapter, you talk about generating and acquiring data as social action. And that I think, you know, a lot of people, even people who've, you know, read a lot of methodology, think that that idea would only apply, you know, to certain types of research, such as action research, as we mentioned before. But you talk about how this applies more broadly. So could you, talk about your thoughts and about this section and why it's important for people right now as we're coming out of this, such a difficult time, at least, being optimistic of thinking that we're coming out of it. Where I think, many social problems we already had have become much more evident, and then we've got a whole bunch of new ones that we hadn't anticipated.
Maybe I could get us started, and
Okay.
please I'll chime in. And I just feel like I agree with you, Janet. It's not a light topic to talk about when it comes to the idea of thinking about research as a social action, because I think this really points to some of the things we really want to deliver in this text, in this book, which is like your work, your research will have real impact, and it will have real implications. And also, we don't want people to consider research as something that people do in a vacuum. It is the social structure, cultural and political structure that shapes the way how we do research. I can give you a just a straightforward example about this. Like I do research both in China and in the United States. And the first thing when I started my research, empirical work, field work in China, maybe almost 10 years ago, was that I realized that, wow, there was no IRB there. So I'm as a researcher coming from I was originally born in China, but I came to do research as a graduate student from an American university. I of course I got the training from my institution's IRB as part of the procedural, about the procedural aspect of research ethics. And then I think about my researcher, my colleagues in China, for example. I consider how the complex social reality they need to navigate, and what are some of the things that shape their work and shape the way how they think about the research ethics. So I'm sure my friends will and colleagues will have a lot to add on this point. I will just stop here.
So I can add something. I think Peng Fei's encompassed a lot of it, but when I think about this question, it really brings me back to this idea that we're really in this textbook, we're presenting a concept of research that is not something that happens disconnected from the social context around us. So this is getting at, what Peng Fei was just saying. But when we do research, every part of that process, we are acting in a social context. And this is why it's so fundamental to think about it in the context for us as we think about, these ideas of identity and power and ethics and knowledge and so forth as the roots of this tree, right? That is the inquiry process, because it's every one of our actions, not just our research as a whole, but all of our actions along the way are social actions with social implications for research participants, for how we're framing our research design and the methodology in terms of the methodological frameworks that we utilize and so forth. And I think we're coming into this with our own, we talk a little bit about in the text, our kind of critical pragmatist perspective. And so, this idea of acting and being and acting is really central to how we conceptualize research. But, we certainly have an orientation towards social justice and thinking about social action as potentially through research transforming the world in some positive way. But I think about social action as much more than just kind of the end result of the research, but really all of it is social action.
Thanks, Karen, for saying that. You can tell we've been working together for years because I listen to my friends and I think, oh, that was like something I was going to say too. And it's such a delightful experience to be at this point in the project and see how much synergy there is. And our thinking has grown and changed a lot too. But I think, academia has produced a kind of alienating relationship with research, I think. And so there's this idea that your impact or how you're affecting the world through your research has to do with how many publications you have and what kind of journals those publications are in. And for students and for practitioners, if that's their way to connect with the research, it's going to be nonsensical. And so I think this idea that we're constantly involved in social action, inquiry is a social action at every moment, is really minimized through an academic lens, which asks you to report the impact through impact factors, the impact of your work through what's the impact factor of the journal you've published in. And we have to work against that as researchers. We have to resist that notion. I mean, we can make those reports, but if we limit our own conceptualization of our research to that kind of alienated social action, then we're really missing the larger context within which we live and move as humans in the world, and people who come to embrace motivations that aren't driven by an impact factor that a particular journal holds. So I think that this whole idea of social action also can seem really strange in an academic institutional view that doesn't really have a way of acknowledging the social action of research outside of a publication.
Right, which gets to all sorts of things about what kinds of research is valued and how, impact as change in the world, making a difference versus impact of having a particular kind of list of publications. But I want to just close with, I think, kind of a related question in terms of, we've talked a lot about both students and practitioners, but who do you think would most benefit from your book? Speaking to potentially faculty members who might be viewing this and thinking about what they want to adopt in their courses, how do you hope people will use your book?
One thing, I'll start us off, and I think probably each of us will have something to say about this, but one thing that strikes me is, in some ways, my vision for how people use the book is similar to my experience using it myself, or my experience reading it myself, which is to be open to the challenge that it poses, to resonate with it, to recognize myself in it, to really engage with it dialogically. And that means that there's going to be lots of different experiences. But my hope for the book is that it's a doorway into lots of conversations, both with us as authors, but also with other people with whom you're sitting next to or working with, or enjoying dinner with, or something like that, that it's an opportunity for dialogue. And I know my friends have
I can add to what Barbara said. I'm just trying to think about my students, the students I taught. Sometimes in the beginning of the semester when they start reading some of the texts and the early chapter, so we also share early draft with some of our students to kind of see how they respond. What I found is when they give opportunity to really articulate what they already know, like some of the idea we said here, like the being and the lived experiences, they already know. They carry expertise and understanding about this world. Once they are giving opportunity to dialogue, to explicating it, to share with each other. I found a lot of students realize, wow, and actually have been doing some inquiry and research in my own life. I just didn't call that. So I think I found yeah, I found a lot of students would be resonating, and especially those who may have felt being alienated, as Barbara said, from that very pervasive academia culture that also tied to our students' perception about research, kind of a hierarchical expert culture, and for them to kind of step a little bit further, have a larger understanding of what research and inquiry, not just what it is, but what can be and even what it should be. And I think that opened up doors. And for instructors, I feel maybe instructors similar to us and how we wanted the impetus to write this book is where we didn't feel, we wanted a text that is touching on those things and in a non-binary, in a non-totalizing, open dialogic way to talk about research and knowledge. And I think instructors like us who are yearning for that kind of opportunity would resonate with that. Yeah.
And I'll just add one quick thing, which is an example actually of someone I have done some work with in the past, who learned about the textbook being published and obtained a copy, and then asked if I would do an qualitative analysis training with, she works for an organization that in the United Kingdom that is a kind of a network of organizations that do youth work in London and the surrounding areas. And you know, one of the conversations that we had, she asked me to do this training, and she was saying that, you know, a lot of these youth workers are exactly that, quite alienated from this idea that they do research or can do research. And, you know, we've had a lot of conversations about the text and this idea of, you know, finding the expertise they already have and finding a way to express it and amplify it. So, you know, in terms of who might use this text, I think also, you know, that what it made me realize is that there are all sorts of opportunities outside of, you know, a graduate class where practitioners are obtaining some either, you know, new skills or ways of thinking about research in the context of the work they do. And I think this text actually is quite applicable for instructors who might be working with practitioners outside of academia as well. It certainly, you know, comes from our own framework as instructors of graduate students, but graduate students who are students mostly, at least as we were first conceptualizing this, professionals who are looking for graduate practitioner-oriented, professionally oriented graduate degrees, and not necessarily students who are you know, planning on doing academic research themselves. So I would hope that perhaps it might be adopted or used outside of the academic sphere as well. I think it's, for me personally anyway, I think it would feel like that's something that would feel right for the text, that it crosses that divide, right? So as Pei was saying, non-binary, non-essentializing, right? So that's, I think, an important piece of our text as well.
I feel like I just want to add one more point. Speaking from my current position and speaking from this sort of like a pretty academic oriented PhD program, like my experience of teaching last fall was like I happen to have in my qualitative foundation course, that's a doctoral level methodology course, and I happen to have some quantitative oriented doctoral students taking that course. That's a required course for them, and we were into this conversation about, you know, how qualitative methodologists consider, say, trustworthiness, consider, you know, issues related to transferability. So they were really They really struggled a lot with this idea of, shifting, making this shift from a very, a world very orienting toward generalization, repetition, validity, and so make this shift seems to be very hard for them. So I changed this part of my readings and made some adjustment to give them some of the roots chapters of this textbook. And I feel like the effect seems to be pretty good in terms of like they seem to be able to better navigate these two languages. I mean, nowadays, if you go out to really, look at the texts produced by quantitative and qualitative researchers, you feel like you really need to speak two languages in order to understand them. But there are ways to really grasp some of the fundamental issues so that you can be bilingual methodologically. So I feel like in terms of using this book in a pretty much academic setting, there may still be some merits and benefit of using that as well.
Well, thank you all for joining me today for this conversation about the ideas behind your book and some of the ways that can be used. And I hope that anyone who is viewing this will take a look at the other posts on MethodSpace from this co-author team and take a look at this new text. Thank you.